There are crimes that are shocking because of their brutality. And then there are crimes that are shocking because of their sheer scale. And then there are some crimes that force an entire legal system, an entire culture, to look at itself and ask whether what we call ordinary is in fact deeply pathological. The Mazan case is not simply about one violent husband. It's about chemical submission, digital complicity, and the normalization of male entitlement in a society that believed that it had already progressed. It is a case where French law, criminology, and feminist history intersect in the body of one woman, Gisele Pelicot, who refused to disappear. Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. I'm Dr. D. If you're new here, well, welcome. Here at Collectively Vigilant, we learn the law through true crime. If that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing to this channel. So let's start in the middle of the pandemic in November of 2020. The south of France was subdued under masks and quiet streets. One morning, inside a supermarket in a small village of Mazan, in the south of France, a retired man in his 70s moves slowly through the aisles, placing items into his cart. Everyone is wearing masks, and so is he. No one even looks at this man more than once. He appears completely normal and very unremarkable. Just an older man doing his morning shopping. At some point between the dairy section and the checkout lane, a young woman suddenly feels something brush too close against her body. She turns, and in that split second, her instinct tells her what her eyes can only see. A mobile phone is angled beneath her skirt by an older man who's wearing a mask. She does not scream, she does not leave, she listens to her gut instinct. Instead of exiting the store, she walks directly to the manager and reports what's happened. The manager then calls the police. The man is still shopping when a single police officer approaches him and says, Bonjour. The old man does not run, he doesn't even resist. He calmly accompanies this police officer to a very small police station in the south of France in a small place called Mazan. The police station is remarkably small. It's a very modest building in a quiet retirement town where almost nothing ever happens. While this man is being escorted away, his wife Giselle is at home, completely unaware that her life is about to fracture beyond recognition. She's been married to this man for nearly 50 years. They're grandparents. They have three fully grown kids in their late 30s and early 40s. They've built a life stretching back to 1971, decades of shared holidays, shared routine, the same coffee at the same coffee table. At the police station, the older man, his name is Dominique, he calls his wife Giselle and then he tells her that he has done something really stupid. He tells her that he deeply regrets what he has done. He tells her that it's really good that he finally got caught and that he will now learn his lesson. He asks her not to tell their children because he's deeply embarrassed. His name, as I said, is Dominique Pelicot and her name is Giselle. She goes to the police station and dutifully collects her husband. The police keep a digital copy of his phone, and then the old couple goes back home. 2 days later, the police summons both of them back. That morning, just like every other morning, was deeply ordinary. Dominique and Giselle have their morning coffee and their pain au chocolat. This was the rhythm of their retirement. They walk to the station together, and once they reach the police station, they're separated. Dominique is taken into one room and Giselle is taken to the other. The police officer sits across from her and tells her that he needs to show her something. The officer, even before showing her something, puts her completely at ease. He says, Well, what kind of man is Dominique? Giselle very instinctively answers. She says, Well, he's very kind, he's very attentive, and he's truly trustworthy. She later says that she gives her husband her complete trust. And then the police officer places three photographs in front of Giselle. At first, she does not recognize herself in those pictures. At first, she says, quote, that is not me, unquote. And then in the second image, she insists the same thing yet again. That's not me. But then the police officer points out familiar objects in the photo: the bedside lamp, the nightstands, the layout of the bedroom. And then Giselle finally puts her glasses on, and there she sees it. She sees a woman laying inert, completely unconscious, on her own bed. Her body is positioned beside a man, and this man she's never seen before. She later explains this moment as if a train had hit her at full speed. Her brain is completely detached from the reality of what she's actually seeing. She describes it as complete disassociation. She could not fully process she was seeing and what she was being told. It was only hours later when she returned home and called her friend Sylvie, and then she speaks that sentence which makes this entire day irreversible. Quote, Dominique raped me and he had me raped, unquote. It is the first time she says the word rape out loud. And as she says it, she feels her life completely collapse. What she does not understand at that point, and what will take months and then years to comprehend, is the scale of it all. Giselle describes this unraveling of her life as she knew it. For the past 9 years, Giselle had been experiencing a lot of issues. Starting in 2011, Giselle had experienced unexplained medical symptoms like memory gaps, sudden absences, cognitive confusion, fogging of the memory. She feared that she was getting Alzheimer's. She consulted three separate doctors. One dismissed her concerns completely, another prescribed her melatonin so that she could sleep better, and the third one suggested that she should just prepare herself for cognitive decline. Time and time again, she went to the gynecologist to get herself checked for unexplained infections she would get, and then unexplained pain and bleeding in the lower part of her body. But no doctor could have imagined that she was being chemically incapacitated. Her husband had been accompanying her to all these appointments for 9 years, and later on, Giselle would describe this as her medical wandering, an odyssey through misinterpretation. Her body was being anesthetized repeatedly. It was as if she was undergoing general anesthesia without even knowing it. And what was worse was that this was being done by her own husband in her own house. This clearly was domination without confrontation. On the same evening at around 8:25 p.m., Giselle picked up the phone, and this time she called her daughter Caroline. On the other end of the line, Caroline was in the middle of an entirely ordinary pandemic struggle. She was persuading her 6 year old son to keep his mask on. It was one of those very small, exhausting rituals of 2020. Elastic bands kept falling, and fabric kept pulled down, and children were always resisting wearing a mask. Caroline's phone rang, and she answered it very casually. Within seconds, though, time stopped completely. Her mother's voice was not the voice she knew. It was controlled but fractured. Giselle did not dramatize anything. She did not scream. She didn't even cry. She just delivered the facts. She said that Dominique, the father, had been arrested. There were photographs. There were men who had come into the house. There were videos, and that she was sexually assaulted. Caroline later described this sensation as the world freezing mid motion. Her body went completely cold. The domestic noise around her, the phone, the child, the television, the evening routine, everything receded into a distant, muffled sound. She was still standing in her kitchen, but psychologically, she was no longer there. Shock does not arrive usually as hysteria, it arrives as suspension. After Caroline, Giselle placed her second call to her eldest son. He was at home with his wife and his two children. It was an ordinary evening, and Giselle told him, "Please go somewhere quiet. I need to tell you something really important." He walked into another room, and that conversation lasted a few minutes. Giselle explained what she had been shown at the police station. She explained the images, she explained the years of unexplained memory lapses. She explained that strangers had entered her bedroom and her body, and that his and the son's father, Dominique, had solicited men to rape her. Her eldest son stood there speechless. Later, he would describe this feeling as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. He described that the structure of his childhood, his parents' marriage, his entire understanding of family had been completely ripped apart from underneath his feet. When the call ended, he walked himself into the bathroom and he threw up. He threw up not because of disgust alone, but because the mind cannot metabolize the rupture of the magnitude of things in real time. The body reacts before even comprehending things completely. This is exactly what secondary trauma looks like. It does not stay confined to the primary victim, it spreads through the entire familial system. Children who did not choose their father but must now reconcile what their father has done to their own mother. And then the waiting period began. The police went through evidence in forensic detail. While Dominique was arrested in November of 2020, the trial did not start immediately. In France, serious criminal matters are investigated by an investigating magistrate under the inquisitorial system. The process is really methodical, it's very document heavy, and it's quite slow. For the next 4 years, digital devices were analyzed. This was hard drives and computers and phones and SSD cards. Files were decrypted, and then systematically, one after the other, all the men were identified and located and questioned. And then they were formally charged. This was not one single assault, it was an entire network of men who had been solicited by Dominique. So the charges fell primarily under the French Penal Code provision governing rape, which is defined as an act of sexual penetration committed through violence, coercion, threat, or surprise. And then Dominique specifically was charged with chemical submission. Chemical submission under French law is defined as the use of substances to render a person unconscious or incapacitated, and this satisfies the coercion element of the definition. Dominique Pelicot was not only charged with committing the R word against his wife repeatedly, but orchestrating and facilitating and enabling others to do the same. Many of the men who were identified through the digital evidence were charged as co conspirators and perpetrators. About 52 of these men were identified, catalogued, interviewed, and then taken up for prosecution. It took 4 years. Giselle, this entire time, lived in suspended animation. She had to review evidence. She had to decide whether the trial should be public or held behind closed doors. Giselle had to confront the possibility of these dozens of men, men from ordinary professions, men from families like her very own, who had walked into her home with full knowledge that she was unconscious. And during those 4 years, her children were not simply observers. They too were processing betrayal at their deepest level. Their father was the architect of it all, and their mother was the victim of it all. There's no manual that's out there which can, tell a family how to survive such an ordeal. The trial began and the family banded together. The three children, their spouses, the grandchildren stood along with their grandmother Gisele Pelicot. She became the first ever rape victim in French history who fought the courts so that the general public and the media could see what was done to her, because she insisted that shame must change sides. Her legal team actually had to fight the judges who were insisting that out of modesty and decorum, those videos should not be shown in open court. However, Gisèle Pelicot insisted that the general public should see what was done to her. At the end, her legal team triumphed, and then began the 4 months of trial against 52 men and her own husband. Now, by no means are the number of men were just 52. As a matter of fact, few men had absconded completely. Some of them were immigrants, and then some of them, their faces have actually not been catalogued, and they have not really been registered till date. Nonetheless, the 4 months of trial began against these 52 men. These 52 men walked into the courtroom every day with their 52 separate defense attorneys. The trial revealed that Dominique himself described his actions as an attempt to make his wife submit. What he called, I wanted to submit an insubmissive woman. Giselle had always been economically independent. She worked, she had opinions, and she had already said no to the things that he had brought up in the marriage. She didn't want to do that. And as a deceptive, deceiving husband, he made her submit nonetheless. When the domination failed to its face, covertly, domination began with the help of drugs. The drugs became an instrument of this kind of coercive power that he had over his wife. The courtroom became another theater of psychological violence towards Giselle and her children. After 4 years of reflection, she had already made the decision that would transform this case from being just a case of private horrors into a case that would make France do a community public reckoning. She opposed that all these things should be closed trials. She insisted all the trials be open to media from around the world. She knew that the videos will be shown. Most of these videos, actually, she had not seen herself because she just couldn't bring herself to do it. She knew that the most intimate violation of her life that her husband had recorded for 10 years would be shown in public. But time and again, she insisted that the shame clings to every single victim like a second skin. And refusing this secrecy was her way of tearing that second skin apart. During this 4 month trial in 2025, she faced not only the accused, but the architecture of rape myths which lie everywhere in the world, including in France. Some defendants, these are those 52 men that I was talking about, claimed that they didn't quite understand that Giselle had not consented to this. They said because the husband had invited them in, that meant implicit consent by Giselle. Other men redefined rape as a violent assault which takes place in public spaces. This, on the other hand, was something which happened in her bedroom, so she must have consented to it. That was their way of defending their own actions. In fact, one defense lawyer went so low as to suggest that the pelvic movement of his client is visible, which shows that he was trying to pleasure Giselle rather than inflict pain upon her. Despite expert testimony explaining how the nervous system works under anesthesia and under muscle relaxants, these men were insisting that what was done to Giselle was completely by her consent. This was that one time in those 4 months when even Giselle walked out of the courtroom to hold herself emotionally. However, she refused to embody the stereotype of a good victim who collapses and cries in court. Even this was used against her by the defense attorneys in this trial. These men, by the way, 52 of them, ranged in age. Some of them started from their early 20s to there were men who were in their late 60s. And even professionally, these men were the entire gamut of French society: teachers, journalists, bakers. There were even immigrants, even illegal immigrants, who were taken into the house by Dominique Pelicot. He used a geolocation website, so all these men were actually localized from the Mazan and nearby area. Gisele Pelicot rejected that these were ordinary men. She said that these men had arrived into her house knowingly and they knew what was going to happen. Yet, not even a single one of these men had the decency to report her husband. Not even a single one of them placed an anonymous call. Not even a single one of them ever wrote a letter saying that this is what's happening. Their participation, all 52 of them, illustrates that illustrates what social psychology calls moral disengagement. These men were framing this harm they had done to this woman by reducing their personal responsibility. And yet again, outside the courtroom, thousands of women gathered every single day for 4 months. Letters arrived addressed to Gisele Pelicot simply as Gisele Pelicot Mazan. However, the postal service by this time knew who Gisele Pelicot was. So even when letters would arrive from all over the world, they knew who to give it to. And this were all being delivered to the legal offices of her lawyers and also to the courtroom. Women from around the world wrote to Gisele Pelicot in 2025, and they wrote about marital rape, about being coerced, about being silenced. Giselle herself described this as being an emotional sponge, that she was absorbing the suffering of all these women, and she would stop reading these letters at times just to protect herself from the brutality of it all. Today, at the age of 73, Gisele Pelicot describes herself as an ordinary woman. She does not describe herself, of course, as a hero. She's a woman standing upright. She does not live in any kind of hatred, not even towards her own husband, which really astounded me when I read it. She speaks instead of the indignation and betrayal that she felt. She intends actually to visit her husband Dominique in prison at some point, to look into his eyes and to ask him why. She also wants to ask him why, especially in relation to their daughter, because turns out that none of the women in the Pelicot family had been safe. There have been pictures that Dominique took of his own daughter and allegedly also of his daughter-in-laws, the two daughter-in-laws, and all these women of the family had been undressed. Even when Giselle thinks back and she says about this whole ordeal, she says she distinguishes herself from the position that her children are in. She says, I chose my husband, however they did not choose their father. She insists on keeping the good memories of the 50 years as well. I don't know how she does that. That blows my mind. She also insists that she cannot entirely erase this man from her life. She cannot erase those memories. And this is where the psychological understanding by trauma specialists comes in. Now, trauma specialists actually note that to identify continually yourself as a victim is not really good for human survival. And it's not always possible to annihilate the past, because once you annihilate the past, you will probably not feel like yourself anymore. So Giselle's message is really clear. She wants the world to know about chemical submission, which is a tool for violence and also a tool of domination. It is not actually rare at all. It's done all over the world in nightclubs. We usually call it drug facilitated assault. And in France, it's called chemical submission. She hopes that when a woman wakes up with unexplained memory loss and unexplained pain in parts of her body, that women around the world will question it. She hopes that physicians around the world will also take note of these things, that they can even happen to much older women. She also hopes that legal reforms will take place around the world. But what matters more to Giselle is that there's a real cultural change. So, what this case teaches us more than anything else is that domination is not always shouting at someone. Domination can come as a whisper. Sometimes domination can dissolve one's memory. Sometimes domination hides inside retirement homes and shared breakfasts and even 50 years of good memories. So when the secrecy is removed, shame must change sides. So that was the story, as it were, of this entire trial that took place in 2025. Now, what I'll do is I'll now try to explain this from a French legal point of view and from a criminological point of view. Now, when it comes to this case, it is the criminological dimension is really crucial. Chemical submission is not merely an assault, it is a type of coercive control at a very neurological level. There are theorists like Ivan Stark. By the way, Ivan Stark is the guy who gave birth to the term coercive control. So, even Ivan Stark's theory of coercive control explains intimate partner violence not as an episodic injury but as a pattern of domination. The goal of such men and women is not a single act, it is to erode the autonomy of the victim. In this case, Dominique took away Giselle's autonomy through drugs and through chemical submission. So, what he did was he eliminated all her resistance by taking away her ability to be awake. He suppressed her memory, and this is how perpetrators control access to the body by silencing women. And if we look at it from a French legal point of view, the core legal definition France has long used is that rape is any kind of sexual penetration, whatever its nature. It's committed by one person onto another person through coercion, through threat, or through surprise. By the way, this is their penal code number 222 and 23. Now, the wording in itself, understanding of rape in France is in the intent versus consent juxtaposition. The wordings explains the intent versus consent fight. In systems that put affirmative consent at the center, the question is, did the complainant agree with what was happening to her? In France's traditional understanding and in the way things work in the courtroom, the burden shifts to, can the prosecutor prove that there was violence? Was the victim constrained? Was there a surprise? So, given the definition of how this works in France, it actually gives men the ability to say things like, "Oh, he just misunderstood," or it gives these defense lawyers the ability to say, "Well, all these men thought that she had consented, and only then her husband had put her up for sale, as it were." Although no money ever changed hands. This is why feminists in France and people who are interested in changing legality of these things, they insist that consent should be made explicit in their definition in the penal code, and that's why reforms need to take place. So all of us are thinking, where does this French law stand now? As of March 2025, France has actually now adopted a law that explicitly sets out a crime of rape within marriage, so marital rape, and also state that marriage does not imply constant consent, and they want to get rid of this mythology of consent once given can never be revoked. Separately, in Article 222 and Article 223, the laws have been updated again in November of 2025. Now, all this has come after the case of Gisele Pelicot and after her husband was put on trial along with those 52 men, and most of them have been given jail sentences, and Dominique Pelicot has been given a jail sentence of 20 years. Now, the unfortunate thing is that not every single one of these 52 men has been put into jail. Some of them have been put into very short jail sentences, and many of them are actually out there just roaming around France just like a normal person. So I was wondering, does France have a sex offender registry? Well, turns out France does have something called FIJAIS, which is their police registry, which basically has a big list of men who have been convicted of, men and women who have been convicted of specific sexual offenses. And that makes sure that these men, whenever they change an address, or they have to come back many times and do like a check in with the police. However, the duration depends on the kind of sexual offense that they were charged with. It's not like the US type of system where you can, on a neighborhood map, see wherever each of these sexual predators are. That's actually very common in the US. As a US citizen or someone who lives there, you actually can zoom in and see where is the closest sex offender around you so that you can keep your children safe. It doesn't work like that in France. So, going forward, there are three things that I need to point out. Okay. France has been moving towards closing a consent loophole in intimate partner violence. Okay. Which is very clear because now they have, starting in March 2025, they have a new law around marital rape, which says that intimacy inside a marriage is no longer a marital duty. Okay, so that's been reformed. The second thing is, because of the case of Gisele Pelicot, the Mazan case has reignited a demand that the actual definition of rape on the inside the legal codes should be changed, and there should be an explicit framing of it as affirmative consent. So unless and until someone gets up and says that yes, I consent to this being done to me, automatically it will be considered as rape. If it's not, if you do not hear or someone does not fully consent verbally. So they're trying to get rid of the gray areas around it. So once they get rid of that gray area, hopefully nobody else in the future in France will be able to get up and say, well, I thought she had consented because she was just lying there, not saying anything. I thought she had consented because her husband called me inside the house. I thought because they're married, he could speak for her. So once France explicitly brings in this consent form, or the format of consent within the legal definition, that would be so much better for everyone living inside France. Now, the third thing is, implicit in this whole thing is that France needs to train its personnel, not only those who deal with these kind of cases, not only police officers, not only ambulance workers, but also people who work in pharmacies and give out this kind of medicine which can be used against women. Now, in the case of Gisele Pelicot, a lot of these muscle relaxants that the husband was getting, the husband was actually getting most of it allegedly from his own brother, who's also a doctor. However, there needs to be tighter laws around it. So, if we look at this whole case from a control and chemical submission kind of criminological analysis, we can bring in Ivan Stark. Okay, we will say Ivan Stark's theory of coercive control describes, as I said earlier, any kind of abuse is just not an episodic thing, it's a systematic thing which goes on for years on end. It's a pattern of entrapment that strips away autonomy. In this particular case of Gisele Pelicot, chemical submission functioned as a technological sort of control over her body. By drugging his wife repeatedly, Dominique Pelicot removed her capacity to resist. He even took away parts of her memory. So, on the part of Dominique Pelicot, it's not a man who just loses it in a moment. It's not impulsive violence, it's structural domination. So, psychologically, this aligns with someone who also likes a little bit of paraphilic humiliation, and he likes this eroticized power, because he becomes that husband who is controlling access to his wife's body. And basically, Dominique Pelicot succeeds in becoming that bouncer, as it were. He stages this entire scene where he calls these men over. He explicitly tells them not to use any protection. He tells them, I will be filming the whole thing, and that's why there are 10 years worth of videos that the police has seized. men like this, men like Dominique Pelicot, become the gatekeepers to the body of their own wife. Okay, in that sense, if you think about it, it's not just about the physical act, it's also about possessing the wife, degrading the wife, becoming the ultimate master of the wife. And the involvement of dozens of these men introduces a very separate criminological lens, which is the lens of collective moral disengagement by these men. None of them had the morality to have pity on this woman and say something. When these kind of individuals, 52 of them, operate within a group, the responsibility diffuses maybe in some way. Each man becomes just one of many, and the abnormality of the whole thing becomes normalized to them because they're using chat forums, they're instructing each other on what to do. Dominique Pelicot was, in fact, on these group sites where he was instructing other men as to how to control their wives through chemical submission. So he's giving out the recipe of which chemical they should use, how much, and how they can put their wives under. So this is a deeply twisted man whose idea of power is seizing her in ways that she can't even comprehend. I think this is why this case is so deeply unsettling, because it was not a stranger doing these things, it was the husband, and the sexual violence is done by the monster you're actually married to. So that's the criminological aspect of it, and there it opens up to so many questions, and I don't think anybody can answer these questions other than the perpetrator himself, Dominique Pelicot, and those 52 men. And remember, there are so many of them who are absconding, who the police could never even charge in the first place. So what happens after the verdict is, though the of course the court has given some of these men a particular sentence of being in jail for some time, but that punishment does not erase risk to the larger society. Some of these convicted men will actually re-enter society. Okay, and of course France is not going to brand them publicly because their privacy policies stop them from doing that. However, maybe France can come up with a new way of monitoring these kind of men, which can be more administrative, not very theatrical. However, the larger question is still a cultural one, okay, which is, will this case of Gisèle Pelicot shift into actual legal reform? Will it accelerate consent based statutory language? Because that has not happened yet, okay? Will medical training be changed so that when an older woman who is postmenopausal comes in, doctors look at her and at least can comprehend that something terrible could have happened to her, right? So will families within France also recognize that chemical submission is a real possibility and is happening to people like them all the time? Or will France continue to just say, well, must be dementia, that's why she doesn't remember anything? Gisèle Pelicot herself, has framed this case as a shift of shame. I think that's the most important thing. She says that shame must change sides, and she's not being rhetorical, it is criminological. When stigma is attached only to a victim, then nobody would ever report such crimes. When stigma attaches to a perpetrator, that's when deterrence actually happens. So, this case may mark a legal milestone. Whether it makes an actual cultural change in France is yet to be seen. Well, that was the amazing story and the amazing life of the heroine of France, Gisèle Pelicot. I hope we learn from so many things about chemical submission, about the legality of how things work in France. I hope we all take inspiration from this lovely woman who's in her mid 70s now. And I hope that all of us at some point can just be half as courageous as her in our lives. Anyway, I'm going to stop here for today. Let me know what you thought about this amazing case of Gisèle Pelicot. And until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.